Good transportation policy begins by respecting people's choices. That's according to the Locke Foundation's Director of Regulatory Studies, Jon Sanders. He wrote about this in a recent piece posted at johnlocke.org. Now, the wrong approach to transportation policy? Well, that would be trying to force people into options that really don't meet their needs. And here in North Carolina, it looks like we overwhelmingly choose personal vehicles for commuting. Jon joins us now to talk about some of these really fascinating statistics. Jon, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Donna.
Okay, so we North Carolinians apparently really, really like our cars and our trucks. Tell us about some of the data you found.
Yes, I've been looking at Bureau of Transportation statistics, which is a very hard word to spit out sometimes when you're speaking fast, data. And over the last few years, already North Carolinians were preferring their cars for commuting. But in the last few years, that preference has increased slightly.
It's really interesting because there's been so much pressure, Jon, and I think advocates for public transit have been telling us, no, you got to get out of your car or you got to have more than one people in your car, yet the data's going the other way. Interesting.
Well, I think people just intrinsically like their cars. And in fact, one of the things that's not in those data are that people are taking things like Uber and Lyft, which means that they would prefer other people's cars than even taking taxis or public transit.
Is it that people just want to be alone, even if they have a driver driving them in the case of Uber or Lyft, but they just want their personal time?
I think part of it is personal space. Absolutely. It would be for me. But also with your own vehicle, you suddenly have a range of options. You have more free time to go out for lunch and more choices available to you. You can make stops on the way from home. You can go to see your kids practice, or, just the range of options is so much greater than if you drive and drop your car off and then take public transit, or if you take some of these other options, even carpooling.
I was also surprised to look at the data that you posted in your piece, Jon, about carpooling, because every now and then as I'm driving on the roads, and I happen to commute with my husband, so most of the time we have two people in our vehicle, but I see two people in cars fairly frequently, so I expected the data to show that carpooling would be either holding steady or becoming more popular, but that's not what you found.
No, the carpooling portion of driving, taking cars to work, fell slightly. And I think what the data are showing, especially in 2013, we had just been coming out of a prolonged recession. And so in the ensuing years, especially in North Carolina, the economy has been getting better, and I think people are opting more and more for having their own vehicles, and so they're able to take those.
And that may explain a little bit about the information you found on public transportation. Tell us about that. Who is actually taking public transit?
Very, very few people, about 1% in North Carolina, and that's down.
And yet, Jon, we see so much emphasis from particularly local elected officials who are always working on long-range plans for additional public transportation. So what does this data say about that?
I think one of the things the data is telling us are that we need to be paying attention to what people choose. We're going to have to deal with the fact that we're very spread out in North Carolina. This is not a bad thing, even though transit planners want to make it sound like that. It makes things difficult in the cities, but it's a good thing to have room to grow and space to move. And if we can expand into the suburbs and drive in, more power to us. I think that's a good thing.
You mentioned earlier that we're seeing more and more people wanting to drive in their cars, and we're seeing some people actually taking Uber and Lyft, so another innovation. But there's also another sector of the commuting workforce that actually isn't commuting because they're working from home.
Right. Working from home was the other major growth section that we saw in commuting choices between 2013 and 2017. That grew by several percentage points, and so it's now at 6.1%. If you're looking at people that take cars, either commuting, driving alone, or which was 80%, and the people who are taking carpools, that ended up being 9 out of 10. But then 60% of those who were left were working from home, which is another thing that we can do, especially with the increase in broadband capabilities and smart work.
You would think that there would be a lot of local officials who are really trendsetters, innovators. They talk a lot about ideas of making things easier and faster for people to do, that they would pick up on some of these statistics about Uber and Lyft, about working from home, and say, you know what, maybe we need to think about our transportation planning a little bit differently. Give us a sense of what we're seeing across North Carolina with transportation planners. Are they heeding the data?
There's generally a push for more busing and more rail. Rail seems to be more romantic in the ideas of planners and especially media. But busing, at least, if you're going to look at public transit, and busing at least offers a choice and a range of routes. Once you build a rail line, you're stuck with it. Busing can adjust to people's choices in ways that rail just simply cannot.
Let's talk a little bit more about rail, because here in North Carolina, we have a rail contingent in the Charlotte area, and we have a line there. And then there has been a multi-year effort in the Triangle for several of the major counties to try to bring federally funded, at least in part, a rail system to the Triangle. But it kind of met its demise several months ago. Give us kind of the landscape of what happened there.
Yeah, it's really complicated and fast-paced thing to try to get through. But basically Durham and Chapel Hill were the ones that went ahead with it, and Wake County wisely said no. And then as planners looked into it with Durham and in more detail, they started realizing it was going to disrupt. It was going to disrupt the university, Duke University. It's going to disrupt sensitive laboratory things that were experiments going on, and it really was just going to be very disruptive for the community for very little gain.
And I think at one point in that proposal, there was also an idea that maybe they would have to start tunneling under at least one road in the Durham area. And suddenly a lot of people realized that, hey, this is maybe getting a little bit close to us here, the potential reality of the funding coming through. And then you saw people rising up and saying, look, this really isn't going to work. Now, is that project dead? I think it's dead at this point.
I think it's practically dead.
Mm-hmm. Interesting that even though the project would be dead, there are taxes in place to help fund that. So what happens there? What would you recommend?
Well, I generally want to return taxes to
Right.
people unless they are absolutely necessary.
It kind of makes you wonder what they're spending the money on then.
Right.
Yeah, very interesting. So are there places where actually rail transit does work well, John? What kind of a landscape or a geography do you have to have?
For any of these transit options, you need an extremely dense urban location. And we simply don't have that in North Carolina.
We have a very suburban and rural lifestyle. It's not uncommon, particularly in the Triangle area, for people to live in one county and maybe work one or two counties away. And so the roads is really the number one way. And of course, this data showing that people want to be in their own personal vehicle and more people working from home. It's a really fascinating look at some of these transportation statistics about North Carolina. You can find it in Jon Sanders' latest piece posted at johnlocke.org. John, thank you very much.
Thanks, Donna.